Okay, I'm Lynne Kilman, and this is part 2 of my teaching unit on individualized instruction. And this part 2 is really the curriculum example of the presentation, where I told you that we would be sort of discussing different ways to individualize the instruction for Julius Caesar or Shakespeare. And your handouts that you have, if you look at page 3 and 4, there are several examples and some links that can help you just sort of see how I planned it out. It will address many different kinds of learners. When you start out with something like Julius Caesar, you have to explain to the kids that, it's really vital to not rush the reading. It's more of a close reading. And so we're reading it really to study in hopes that one day you could enjoy it. So make sure that the students understand that, and that don't be afraid to read it out loud, because it should be read out loud. And if I was there, I would I'd have one of you volunteer to read this soliloquy by Anthony out loud. But you don't have to do that. But if you are in class, you should choose a student who's very capable for the first reading of something like this. Don't choose someone who would struggle with it. And if you don't really have anybody like that in class, then the teacher can read it out loud the first round. But you'll usually read it out loud several times. You can also partner the kids up for this after you've read it once, and then let them analyze it together. If they're worried about analyzing it on their own, partnering is a good thing for something like this. So I'm going to demonstrate several examples of the instruction here, and that way you can kind of see what your options are. First of all, whenever I teach something like this, I value getting to write on the scene. Whether you make copies for the students or they have their own books, let them write in the books. I mean, that doesn't hurt anything. It only helps, especially when it's something as complicated as Shakespeare. What I also tell them is they need to focus on a couple of lines at a time, and depending on the level of your students, you can even draw lines or tell them where to draw lines within the soliloquy, so they know which lines to focus on. Like lines 1 and 2 go together, lines 3 and 4 go together, and that's where they should try to analyze just little bits at a time, instead of trying to deal with the whole piece. Now, I do read the whole piece and then say, hey, what do you think it means? And then we go back and analyze. Make sure they go slow. The third thing that they should do whenever you're studying something like this is they need a dictionary, and it can be a real dictionary, or they like to use their phones, so they could download dictionary.com. It's an app. There's an app for that. And that works really quick. And also I tell them to remember that the words are very old. It was written in the 1500s, so they want to look at the archaic meanings of things a lot of the time. Sometimes they have to figure out which definition Shakespeare was trying to use. Okay, so just kind of to get started here, if we had above average students or advanced students, one of the things that I would do after we studied this and other speeches from Act 3 and 4 is to have them memorize it for a recital. It's tough, but I find value in it. It helps you figure out how how Shakespeare thought, how the actors had to speak during that time, and especially sort of the difference in where the subjects and the verbs go now versus then. And they would have to practice it a lot. Sometimes I think they could video it like this and watch themselves. There'll be a teacher questioning sheet uploaded in the doc sharing file, and that way you can see how I sort of question the class when we go over something like this for the first time. You can download it if you want. If I was there, I probably wouldn't go over all of it because time wouldn't allow it, but I would analyze parts of it, and I would have you guys partner up and analyze it, and then tell us what you have figured out that it meant based on some of the things that I asked you to go over. At the very bottom of this, if you have students who are struggling readers, or maybe they were absent, or they just need clarification or self-check, it's a good system, whether it's for honors or struggling kids. They can go to the enotes.com, and if you go down to Act 3 where we are in this, there'll be highlighted sections like where it says, "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth." If you click on that, that's highlighted, then on the right side of the computer, it'll tell you exactly what Shakespeare meant by that. And those are the things that I would discuss too if it was in class. But if kids are on their own or they need to remind themselves of what we discussed in class, this enotes.com is a perfect tool for teaching themselves. Because it's a lot to Shakespeare's a lot to remember, and even though they may have paid attention in class, they may have forgotten it, and so they'll need to go and review, especially if you really want them to figure it out. And if they're first-time Shakespeare readers, they're not going to remember everything, but if you focus on several scenes that you think are truly important, and you study those, and you go over those, and you study those, and you question those, then they'll at least get that part of it. They'll remember that part of it too. They'll have learned it. And especially with Shakespeare, you have to teach them how to analyze it, because kids don't know. They don't know how to analyze. They end up summarizing. So you have to go over it step by step and show them through questioning how you figure it out. I also tell them a lot of times that Shakespeare's kind of like, I think Yoda in Star Wars. He's always kind of talking backwards versus how we talk now. Also, underneath the eNotes link, I let my students in class, or if they can at home, after each act, if they're struggling, we watch the DVD of Julius Caesar, and I like the one with Charlton Heston, and it's a good follow-up for each act, but make sure you watch it afterwards. Usually with my advanced kids, I don't do this until maybe the very end, or they sometimes get together and do it if they like the book or the play. But that will also help anybody who's struggling. Also, it helps limited English proficient kids to see it acted out. Even though they may not understand the language when the actors are talking really fast, they can use their body language, and they can figure out what's going on. Use clues. Also on this handout, the one that says nfssparknotes.com, that's the No Fear Shakespeare, which I do not recommend at all for regular students, especially honor students. The only time in my classes that I would ever let anyone use No Fear Shakespeare is if they were special ed or limited English proficient, or students who struggle a lot. Even like kids that are hearing impaired, those are the kinds of kids I would let use No Fear Shakespeare. But it is not acceptable. Regular kids who learn fine and advanced kids they'll never learn how to read Shakespeare or how to decide. It's almost like deciphering code and thinking, critically thinking if you give them the cheat sheet. So even though like in their lives they may never need to know how to read Shakespeare, it's more than just reading and enjoying something. It's really about figuring out how to decipher it and to study it, and to think deeper than what we normally do. And also to sort of get an idea of how Shakespeare wrote it in the time period for it. Another thing that I really like to use, depending on the time that I have in class, is the LibriVox audio, and sometimes Gutenberg.org will have the audios of them too. And I like the audios with plays like this because it gives you the different voices, and so it'll establish those voices in a kid's head. And so if they then read on by themselves, like at home or later, they can still sort of recognize the different voices in their heads for each character, and that helps kind of to understand what somebody sounded like. Also, the LibriVox is good for kids who are visually impaired. I've had kids that actually weren't visually impaired, but they were deaf, and so we had to utilize things like the eNotes and the SparkNotes for them to understand, because they're not getting to hear the lecture or the questions that I give unless they're reading it. And like I said, it will also help anyone who's new to the English language. On the back side, or the last page, page 4 of my handout, that's the side-by-side comparison of Shakespeare. It's the No Fear Shakespeare is what they call it on SparkNotes. And I lined it up side by side so that you could see how they interpret each line. And most of the times they're right. Sometimes they they have a different opinion than I do, and that's fine. But that's what we can. If you let kids read the No Fear Shakespeare, make sure that you have the older version, I can't even talk, the Shakespearean version of it side by side, so they can read both, so they can see how Shakespeare interpreted it. One last thing, and then I'll be done with my presentation. And I have this posted on the doc sharing, but they need to always write out to the side of each line what they think it means, and anything that they, any questions that they have. Also, if they identify any kind of literary element. I mean, Shakespeare's great for teaching all the different literary devices and elements and tropes, especially for your honors kids. And those are the kinds of things they need to write out to the side. And then when you go over it in class, I mean, sometimes even kids figure out things that I haven't even thought of, even though I've taught it for all these years. I've taught Julius Caesar probably 10 times, and so every time I teach it, I find out something new. That's kind of one of the fun things about Shakespeare. Even, someone our age is going to learn something new. That is it. So, thank you for listening.